Thanks so much for having me and for being here. I'm excited to tell you about some research that I've been working on with some colleagues at the University of Colorado Boulder, looking at collaborative research on grassland fuels and management. So I'm an ecologist at the University of Colorado. I'm a researcher, and I've been working on this project closely with Katie Suding, who's a professor at the University of Colorado as well. And we're both sort of plant ecologists, really interested in understanding how grassland communities are changing and responding to the way that our world is changing, both sort of in the background with climate change and things like that, but also with the way that we manage our grasslands, which, as we all know, there are a lot of them in this landscape. So here's a picture, for example, of one of our study sites, and you can see just like how much grassland there is sort of scattered around our landscape and how important it is in our landscape. And so just some background on the project. We started this really following the Marshall Fire because there were a lot of questions that sort of surfaced about how do we manage grasslands in a way that is sort of healthy, but also can reduce wildfire risk. Because, yeah, there's this fire sort of system in our landscape that is only getting more and more frequent. And so understanding how we can manage our grasslands in a way that reduces risk for people, but still keeps them healthy is really important. And as we were trying to figure out maybe how to actually provide some answers to these questions, we realized that we actually don't know very much about sort of grassland fuels, how they might be changing, how they might affect fire behavior. And so it inspired this sort of, let's try to answer these questions with data that we collect here to inform local practices. And so I think this is a sort of good example of kind of where our knowledge sits about grassland fuels. So this scene up here in the upper left-hand corner, these are all the same scene from sort of near Marshall Lake. This is El Dorado Canyon Road, or yeah. And this scene up here is the scene of the sort of most commonly used fuel model that people use for fire risk assessments. And it's a product produced by the USDA that shows sort of our best understanding of fuel types and how these different types might affect fire behavior. And what you might notice is there's a lot of yellow pixels here. And so this is all indicative of a sort of normal dry grassland fuel type. And that's what the vast majority of our landscape is categorized in these fuel models. There are some other fuel types scattered in here, which might include a little bit more woody plants or a little bit more production. But overall, we have a pretty simple fuel model according to this product. But we think that this actually sort of glances over a lot of really important variation on the landscape. So in this scene here, the bottom left-hand corner, we actually have estimated biomass productivity from satellite imagery. And so these, where the darker green is places that are producing more plant material, more biomass, more fuel to fuel fires. And if you notice, there's kind of a lot of variation in here compared to all of the sea of yellow. And so this could actually really change the way that fires behave across the landscape that would not be captured super clearly in this fuel model we have here. Another perspective we can look at is on the right-hand side is a map of the plant communities that the city of Boulder has mapped across their property. So all of the colored areas are areas owned by the city of Boulder. And the colors indicate different types of plant communities. They're mostly all grassland type communities, but there are different species that arrange in different ways and that have different sort of characteristics that might affect fire behavior. So some of them are bigger and more productive. Some of them are sort of smaller, but they grow earlier in the season. And so understanding sort of the differences between these different types of plant communities could also be really important in understanding fire behavior and how fire could move across our landscape. And so the project that we set out to do involves sort of three main objectives. First, we just want to get a better handle on this variation in grassland fuels. So we're doing a bunch of work to collect data to describe sort of landscape variation and seasonal variation in these grassland fuels. Our second objective is then to actually look at different potential methods for sort of managing grassland fuels to see, first of all, how effective they are in doing that, but then also how effective they might be in sort of maintaining grassland function from other perspectives like plant diversity or soil health and that kind of stuff. And then finally, we aim to bring sort of these two things together to then use fire behavior models across the landscape to better sort of be able to assess the potential effectiveness of different types of fuel management methods. And so we'll be looking at this along with sort of the questions that land managers have about where and when is it best to do different things to both minimize sort of potential fire risk to the built community, but then also maintain grassland functions that we care about. And before I go any further, I think that it's really important to mention that this has been a very, very collaborative project. It wouldn't be possible essentially without collaborations across many municipalities around the area, and then a bunch of different sort of organizations that have really helped to sort of connect us as researchers with the people who live around here, the land managers who are sort of in charge of taking care of our land. And so all of these organizations have been super, super helpful, from funding to guiding questions to sort of guiding outreach and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of people to thank in the process of this. And so I just wanted to dive in a little bit into each of our objectives, show you sort of what we've been doing or what we plan to do, and then we'll sort of wrap up from there. So this first objective, looking at variation in grassland fuels, this is the one that we're the furthest along. We started this about a year and a bit ago. And what we've done is set out a network of 120 fuel monitoring plots across Boulder County and to some extent Jefferson County. And so these are all the dots scattered around here. You can kind of see sort of here's Boulder, here's Superior down here. And we've monitored these plots now 3 times. So once last summer, once last fall, once this summer now, and then we'll do it again this fall. And then we plan to continue this for at least 2 more years and maybe even longer, to go to all these different places, measure fuel characteristics like biomass, fuel moisture, plant height, how much is living, how much is dead, all this kind of stuff that can be really important in understanding for fuel fire behavior, as well as other things like the plant community composition, soil characteristics, topography, whether there are prairie dogs present, all these sorts of things that could allow us to take these points and then build models to be able to predict across the landscape what fuel structures should potentially look like. And so here, another, I guess, important thing is we've spread out these plots based on different types of plant communities. So we have things that have sort of characterized by tall grass prairies to short grass and mixed grass prairies, weedy places, cattails, to really get an idea of how different types of plants might produce different types of fuels. And so I'll go over just a few little bits of results. So this is kind of a lot in these graphs, but we'll walk through it piece by piece. These are the results of models where we put in all of the information we collected last year and tried to figure out what factors best predict how much biomass we have at these different points. And so we found that actually 4 different things are important. And these are the 4 things. The first one up here is aspect. So this is a kind of confusing one, and I honestly don't even know very well how to interpret these results. So I won't dwell on it, but aspect essentially is like the direction that a slope is facing. So 0 and 360 degrees are north-facing slopes. 180 would be south-facing slopes. And so from that, we can determine that, for example, west-facing slopes tend to be hotter and drier because they get direct sun exposure in the later part of the day when it's the hottest. Whereas it's sort of the opposite on east-facing slopes, where they get cooler weather because they're getting the sunlight in the morning when it tends to be cooler and moister. And so that thing makes some difference, although it's pretty subtle in our results. Something that's much more sort of important is that prairie dogs really matter. So when there are prairie dogs present, you tend to have much less biomass on the landscape. And we probably can all sort of, or maybe are not surprised by this, because whenever you go around a prairie dog colony, you can really see the vegetation changes, and it tends to get much shorter, and it tends to become dominated by species that just don't produce a lot of biomass. Whereas when prairie dogs are absent, you tend to have higher biomass. Another thing that turned out to be important was just the amount of perennial plants. So those plants that grow back year after year, it's kind of self-evident potentially, but when you have more perennial plants, you tend to have more biomass. So this kind of makes sense, but it's a good sort of check to see that these are sort of making sense. And then finally, sort of interestingly, we see that plant community type does make some difference in how much biomass is produced, especially if you look at the sort of smooth brome communities and these ruderal communities. Both of these are sort of weedy, non-native plants that we don't exactly love on our landscape. they actually tend to produce the most biomass. And so this might lend some evidence that we should be focusing on reducing these sort of non-native plants in favor of some of the maybe tall grass species or mixed grass species that tend to have a little bit less consistent biomass buildup across space. And so we can take these sort of predictions from these models and then actually create maps based on them to be able to better inform sort of where do we have higher and lower biomass on our landscape. And so this is the same figure that we saw before. It's a little bit bigger, but it's still the same area around Marshall Lake. And now this is based on our data where more blue areas indicate lower biomass and more sort of yellow areas indicate higher predicted biomass. And we see that these blue splotches are all prairie dog colonies. And so it sort of confirms this really important effect of prairie dogs. And then we can see some other sort of interesting features here. So like up here, these yellow splotches are all actually irrigated hay fields or pastures. And so they get water additions throughout the season. And so they get this sort of higher potential biomass. But also maybe important to note is that they're hayed most of the time. So the biomass is then removed before the sort of biggest fire window or fire season. And so that might be an important thing to take into account. So maybe these aren't areas that we really need to focus on because they're already being managed in a way that doesn't sort of promote fire spread. And then you might want to focus on sort of areas that maybe are closer to communities that still retain relatively high biomass. And so I will note that this is like very much version 1.0 of these maps. There's still a lot of work to be done to improve their sort of accuracy, test them more rigorously, and include multiple years of data, right? So this is based off of a really wet year from last year. This year, on the other hand, has been really dry. And so with the data we collected this year, we'll be able to look at sort of what is the effective difference in precipitation or rainfall on this sort of landscape, and do different types of plant communities respond differently to this variation. So I'm excited to see what that looks like, and hopefully it becomes really useful in sort of honing in our predictions of how fuels look across the landscape. So then our second objective is then to test these different types of management methods. And this is something that we're just working on getting off the ground now. We're hoping to do our first sort of interventions or treatments this fall. And so what we're setting up is a distributed experiment. So we'll have 8 different locations, mostly across sort of the southern part of Boulder County. And what we'll do at each place is do some sort of management method that are things that people are considering trying to do here already. And so this includes mowing to mow down fuel, grazing, and then also using prescribed fire. And so each of these have sort of their own pros and cons associated with them. And we hope to sort of measure that and be able to use it to really assess what might be the best approach across this landscape for moderating fuel loads. So mowing, for example, might be the easiest to implement. You just need a mower and some people to run it. But it might also be a sort of expensive way and a sort of not very environmentally sustainable way because you have to burn this fuel and you have to buy the fuel and all the people and everything. So this might be a good thing sort of at small scales, but once you start to scale it up, it might become really, really infeasible. Grazing, on the other hand, is something that can be scaled up pretty well. And we do it a lot on our landscape already. So there's quite a bit of sort of culture and movement around this already. But grazing is a little bit unpredictable. You might not know exactly where the cows will focus, and they might not focus on sort of the edges where you care about, that kind of stuff. And so being able to understand that sort of dynamic, I think, will be really important in assessing grazing. And then fire is a bit tricky, right? Because why would you burn to reduce the chance of fire? But actually, this is a really common practice that people use for reducing fire risk, because if something has been burned, it really can't burn again in most cases, at least for a little while, right? And so we think that prescribed fire could actually be really a beneficial potential treatment here, because these landscapes where we live, they are adapted to fire, and they've had regular fire every, people think, sort of 3 to 10 years probably, for a long, long time. And then when we came around and sort of settled this area, much of it was stopped, and that probably has had really big implications for the types of plants that have thrived, where and how woody plants grow, all this kind of stuff. And so adding prescribed fire could actually really increase diversity and potentially increase sort of soil health and things, but this is something we hope to test. And so, yeah, with these different treatments, we will then measure how sort of fuel characteristics respond to these treatments over time, but then also measure these other sort of side effects that are potential. So thinking about plant diversity, whether these treatments open up the potential for more native or non-native species to move in, thinking about soils and soil carbon, nutrients, stabilities, how much erosion might happen if we do these different things. And then also thinking about sort of forage production and quality, because ultimately grazing is a really important use for a lot of the grasslands around here. And so maintaining that is really important. And I'll say that this is a place where having these partners that I talked about is really, really important because us as scientists, we're not actually doing any of this mowing, grazing, or prescribed fire. This is being done by professionals who sort of know how to do this stuff and know how to do it right, especially on the prescribed fire side, right? So we're working with the sort of City of Boulder Fire and Rescue, the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, Mountain View Fire Protection District to implement these fires and to make sure that we're doing them in a safe and effective way. And so just to show, this is a map of where we are planning to do our experimental sites. Each of these sort of sets of colored blocks is a site where we have these treatment plots outlined in these colors. And so you see that they sort of span this whole area that we've been focusing on already around Marshall Lake. And they are sort of purposely set around in this area to capture the types of grasslands that we see sort of across the county. So we have some in this more northern area that are wetter, have taller grass species. We have the ones up here in Marshall Mesa that are much drier, have much shorter species, are a little bit more sort of patchy. And then we have some weedy places sort of over here is really dominated by smooth brome, similarly over here. And so this is meant to sort of capture the variation, the types of grasslands we expect to see across the landscape so that we can look at whether responses depend on what type of species are there or what the setting is. So that's sort of why we have this arranged this way. And if we zoom in on each place, it'll look something like this. Each of our treatment plots will be about 1 acre, and they'll be essentially a place where we exclude cattle from an area where grazing happens normally. And so we'll exclude cattle using electric fences to keep them away from our treatment plots. We'll have a control plot where nothing happens, a mowing plot where we mow in the fall every year, and then a burn plot where we'll burn hopefully this fall, and then probably not for another couple of years, at least 2 or 3 more years, just because annual burning isn't something that would be really sustainable here. And then in each of these, we'll have plots where we actually make all the measurements that we care about. And yeah. And so then this last objective, this sort of evaluating scenarios, this is the part that we're still really working on developing, and we're working really closely with our partners to really figure out like what are the relevant questions to ask or what are the sort of scenarios to evaluate that are most useful to actually making informed management decisions. And so essentially we'll try to leverage fire behavior modeling to look across the landscape with our sort of more detailed fuel models in combination with what we measure on the effects of different interventions to be able to determine sort of what we think, at least in theory, should be most effective for reducing fire behavior in certain key areas, or if you do some sort of management regime across this space, how does the arrangement or the timing of that really make a difference in potential sort of changes in fire behavior should a wildfire arise in these scenarios. And so this part I think will be really important and super interesting. And I'm really excited to be able to combine the data we're collecting from the field to be able to sort of inform these models and then give people sort of some different scenarios or different options and how they might play out into the future. So that's all I have. Thanks a bunch for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that might come up. We do have a website for this project. If you just search for the Suiting Lab at Colorado, you'll find a page of ours. And then if you want to reach out, this is my email. I'm happy to sort of talk more with anybody who might be interested. So yeah, thanks a bunch. I will stop sharing. And yeah.
Thank you, John. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very informative. Does anybody have any questions?
I'll ask a question just to make sure John is awake.
Sure.
Um, That was great, John. And I'm sorry I didn't get to get the word out to more people because I
Oh, no
think there's a
worries.
lot more people who should see this. So save
It's a
it and
recording though, so you can send links.
we'll do
So,
it again.
but
I guess the timing piece is always interesting to me. I mean, you say you're not going to burn for 3 more years. I mean, I think it'd be neat to see some kind of timeline of because I'd like to have information of the impacts of a prescribed burn after 1 year and after 2 years.
yeah,
And how are you going to roll out results, I guess, and what's your thinking on that process?
that's a super good question. Yeah, and um, it is so. Yeah, so I mean, we will make measurements right after the fire and moving forward a year after the fire, and then it's a matter of just how do we communicate them and sort of prepare them in a way that's useful. And so, um, that's yeah, we'll definitely do that and like prepare reports um, for people, but what that looks like exactly, I'm kind of open to, I guess. And like, what is it most useful to have like some written thing, or is it most useful to like sit down and talk with people and just show like what we found, or a mix of both, or so. Yeah, I don't know. I'm open to sort of ideas.
I would suggest the non-academic approach, and
Yeah.
that is, well, I mean, where you have to have a peer-reviewed journal entry or so. I mean, I think some kind of getting people out on the ground would be cool on occasion.
Yeah.
Getting just like a every 4 month update on what you're seeing and inviting
Mhm.
people to come out and just less, maybe not as rigorous as what you might require for your PhD,
Yep.
but more useful for decision makers as they're saying, what do we want to do here next? You know, it's December. We got to plan our spring activity. What do we want to do?
Yeah.
Let's look what we learned from John, you know. So some thinking of some way to make it a little more instantaneous and timely would be great.
That sounds awesome. And honestly, yeah, I feel like I have a lot to learn in that realm. So yes, these ideas are great, and we should continue talking about like how we could facilitate this best. We are talking about with this sort of living with wildfire thing, a field trip to see either my sites or something similar. In the future, timing, who knows? Not sure yet, but there's at
And
least we've
hey,
been talking about this.
and just to be clear on your map of where you're doing the treatments, you're doing the same thing. You're doing grazing, mowing, and burning all in the same vicinity of each other at each of the sites. It's happening in all of them.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
I
Yeah.
think people will love to get out and see that. And
Yeah.
let's talk about that some more because I'd love to help with that.
Totally. That'd be great. Cool.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Hey, John, it's Mike Foster, Boulder County.
Yeah.
Thanks
Hi.
for the presentation. I don't know if I heard this, but did you share approximately when you think some of those prescribed burns would start?
Our goal is sometime in October slash November, is our sort of goal window. And it depends on a lot of things like whether we can get the right window with weather and all that kind of stuff. But
Yep.
that's our target. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. It looks like there is some chat questions too. And so for the grazing, we'll be using cattle in this case, but goats is a really interesting thing that different people have been testing already, right? So I'm pretty sure Superior and Louisville both have had cat or goats out around, and we're not going to be doing that on our own per se, but I know that there's been people collecting some data on their effects as well, and that I think it is a cool alternative use or like another use for livestock and smaller scales, maybe more sort of closer to the urban environment and that kind of stuff. And then so mowing, I think timing does matter a lot. And we are aiming for fall mowing. So essentially like getting rid of the biomass or like pushing it down closer to the ground, sort of at the end of the season when that fire risk window becomes more extreme. But there is so the on the other hand, like mowing earlier in the spring might be better at controlling a lot of the non-native early season grasses that we actually don't like on our landscape and that tend to be quite productive. And so if you can mow earlier, you might mow them before they start to reproduce, and that could really slow down their growth. And there are people checking on that as well. So, but we just with the like complexity of the project, we're not able to like look at different seasons for everything. And so we're just going to focus on the fall, but knowing that spring might have sort of different outcomes, or even summer, but we'll just be focusing on the fall. And then yeah, ruderal means it means essentially like weedy plants. So things that like establish quickly in disturbed areas. So like roadsides are often really full of ruderal plants. Cheatgrass is a really good example of a ruderal plant. There's a bunch of other sort of non-native plants that are these ruderal plants. Kochia is another one. Smooth brome to some extent is, but they're these yeah many times invasive species or not native species that really can take advantage of places that we've disturbed, and spread from there. And so they're yeah often not the like most high quality areas. But thanks for the questions. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So when you start to get around to the prescribed birdie around, how will you let the community know what's going on and how to reassure some of the people that may have some fears around that? Because
Yeah.
that's a big topic for sure.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good question. And so this is in part, we are working with sort of these partners because they have some system already in place for at least making sure that like the proper authorities know, so that we don't get sort of any emergency response that's not needed and all this kind of stuff. But we are also working on figuring out good ways of sort of involving the community and notifying the community in as much as a sort of good way as possible. And so actually what that will look like is still a little bit up in the air. But something that we are considering, I think, which would be good is just like sending out mailers to everybody that's within a certain area of where we intend to burn, just to give updates. So, or like give plenty of notice and sort of the chance to reach out to us with any sort of questions or concerns. And that's probably what we'll end up doing. That's sort of, and we've been talking with the Watershed Center and the Boulder Watershed Collective about different strategies, and hopefully like this can also be sort of useful in just spreading some word about what our plans are and why we want to do this sort of stuff. But yeah, that's sort of what we were thinking.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Hey, Taylor, I mean, Boulder County puts out this newsletter every 2 weeks and talks about everything that's going on their public lands. I would think the government entities could also help get the word out officially that there's going to be this scientific burning going on, and at least giving it a little more credibility than, a postcard from John. I don't know how far that would go.
Yeah, no, that's a. I am hoping that like the official channels can be very much relied upon. Yeah.
Although getting a postcard from John would be very impactful, I'm
Yeah.
sure, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now that, so I mean, it always comes out 2 weeks after the burn, but just get it in the queue somehow early, John, and just say this is going to be happening. And
Totally.
even if you don't know the dates yet, at least people will start to see it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And yeah, who would I reach out to for that, do you think?
Well, maybe start with you. You're working with Seth, you're working with Stefan.
Yeah.
Those guys just say, how do we start getting some PR on this through the county
Okay.
well in advance? Because we
Yep.
don't know what the dates are, but Mike Foster could likely help
Yeah,
us
there you
with
go.
that.
Yeah, Paul, Vivian Janapur, who's our PIO for Boulder County Parks and Open Space, is already on this, and
Great.
Allison and I have been in constant communication about the timing. I think one of the critical pieces we're just waiting for is a closer window of when we think the burn is going to be. Like, we
Yeah.
think it's going to occur in the month of November, and then we can start notifying folks, because I think from a PIO perspective, one of the concerns that we have is, well, it could be October or November, and that might be a little too wishy-washy for the public. So we want to try to narrow the window down to a timeline that we think is going to be a little bit more realistic, so we can say it'll likely occur, weather
Yeah,
permitting,
like
and
in
all this
these
other
couple
stuff
of weeks.
during
Yeah.
this window.
Yeah. And I'll check on whether people are able to like think about this in a little bit more detail on what exactly the window might be. But I think it is really difficult, right? Because we don't know how long burn bans will be in place. And
Yep.
yeah, just like yeah, whether the weather lines up right and all this kind of stuff.
Need a couple more weeks of this rain.
Yeah, right. If it keeps raining like this, hopefully not too much longer, but yeah.
All right. Well, let's catch up sometime after the call, John. But
Totally.
hey, save November 1st, the next Grasslands meeting to come give an update on this presentation and move
Okay.
things, show where you've been over the last couple months.
Totally. Yep. I've got it on my calendar already.
And
Thank
Paul
you.
also mentioned that I've had similar conversations with the commissioner's office. So they're aware that we're running this research project and they are all thumbs up. And so we'll be coordinating with the commissioner's office to get messaging out as well.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks. That's great.
Party
The
on,
goal here is to
John.
over communicate.
Well, better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. Great.
Any other questions? We'll wrap it up early so we could give everybody some time back if there's no more questions. Well, if you think of any, after this webinar is over, feel free to email John questions. I have recorded this webinar, so I will be putting this in our video library on our disaster preparedness and recovery website. So give me a couple of weeks before that gets up there, and then we can email it out as a follow-up email as well, so you know where to find it. Any last ones, John?
No, I don't think so. Thanks so much for putting this together. And yeah.
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah,
Thanks, Taylor.
thank you,
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. See you
Bye,
later.
everybody. Thank
Ciao.
you.